Jake Morrison checked his pulse rifle for the third time that morning as the research ship U's Discovery dropped out of hyperspace near Kepler 442c. The Marine Sergeant had been on dozens of missions like this one, but something felt different today. Maybe it was the way Dr. Lisa Carter kept pacing around the bridge, or how quiet the usually chatty crew had become. As they approached the mysterious planet, the planet looked normal enough through the viewports. Green and blue swirls of atmosphere covered most of the surface with patches of brown and gray that might be continents. What made this place special were the energy readings they had picked up from deep space. Someone or something was down there, and it was using technology that human scientists had never seen before. Captain Ryan Mitchell gave the order, and the landing shuttles launched toward the surface. Jake sat with 5 other Marines in the cramped passenger section, while Dr. Carter and her research team occupied the seats across from them. The scientist kept checking her equipment and muttering to herself about atmospheric composition and electromagnetic signatures. The shuttle pilot announced. They were approaching the landing zone, and Jake felt the familiar flutter in his stomach as they began their descent. Through the small porthole, he could see ruins scattered across a wide valley. Tall spires made of some kind of crystal material reached toward the sky like frozen lightning. Between the spires were smaller buildings that seemed to grow from the ground rather than being built on top of it. They landed with a soft thud, and the Marines were first out of the shuttle. Jake swept his rifle across the landing zone, while his team took defensive positions around the shuttle. The air smelled sweet, like flowers, but with an undertone of something metallic. Everything was quiet, except for a soft humming sound that seemed to come from the crystal spires. Dr. Carter and her team emerged from the shuttle carrying scanners and sample containers. She immediately began taking readings while the other scientists spread out to examine nearby structures. Jake kept one eye on the perimeter and one eye on the civilians. His job was simple: keep the scientists alive while they did their work. The first few hours passed without incident. The research team documented strange symbols carved into the crystal surfaces and collected samples of the unusual building materials. Jake began to relax as his Marines established a secure perimeter round what appeared to be an abandoned city. The place felt old, but not dangerous. That changed when Dr. Carter called out in excitement from inside one of the larger structures. Jake jogged over to find her standing in front of a wall covered in moving symbols. The markings seemed to shift and dance across the surface like living things. But that was not what made Jake grip his rifle tighter. Standing next to Dr. Carter was something that definitely was not human. The creature was tall and thin with pale blue skin that seemed to glow from within. Its eyes were large and dark, like pools of water, and its movements were graceful in a way that reminded Jake of dancers he had seen back on Earth, the alien war. Simple robes that seemed to be made from the same crystal material as the buildings. Dr. Carter was trying to communicate with the being using hand gestures and simple drawings on her tablet. The alien seemed curious rather than afraid and responded with its own gestures. Jake kept his weapon lowered but ready as he watched the first contact between humans and an alien species unfold in front of him. The peaceful moment was shattered by a sound that made every instinct Jake had developed over years of combat scream. Danger. It was a clicking noise mixed with something like a roar that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. The blue-skinned alien immediately began to tremble, and its large eyes went wide with what was clearly terror. Jake spun toward the entrance of the building and saw shapes moving in the distance. At first, he thought they might be more of the peaceful blue aliens, but as they got closer, he realized these were something entirely different. The approaching creatures were huge, easily 10 feet tall, with bodies that looked like a nightmare. Combination of insect and reptile. Their skin was black and shiny like armor, and they moved on 6 legs that ended in claws. designed for tearing and killing. The clicking sound got louder as more of the monsters appeared. Jake counted at least a dozen of them, spreading out in a hunting formation that was all too familiar to his military mind. These things were predators, and they had found their prey. The blue alien next to Dr. Carter made a sound that might have been words in its own language, but to Jake it sounded like crying. Other blue-skinned beings began emerging from hiding places throughout the ruins. Some were adults, like the first one, but others were clearly children based on their smaller size. All of them were trembling with fear as the black creatures closed. Jake grabbed his radio and called for immediate evacuation of all research personnel. Captain Mitchell's voice crackled back asking for details, but Jake did not have time to explain. The monsters were moving faster now, and he could see their mouths opening to reveal rows of teeth that looked designed for one purpose only. Dr. Carter was trying to convince the first alien to come with them, but the creature seemed frozen with terror. Jake made a decision that would change everything. Instead of following protocol and retreating with the research team, he stepped forward to place himself between the trembling alien and the approaching monsters. The closest predator paused. When it saw Jake, its multiple eyes focused on him with what looked like confusion. Jake raised his pulse rifle and aimed at the center of the creature's torso. The alien predator tilted its massive head as if trying to understand what this small, soft-skinned being thought it was doing. Jake pulled the trigger, and the energy blast caught the monster in what he hoped was its chest. The creature staggered backward, making a sound like metal scraping against stone. Green fluid leaked from the wound, but the thing was far from dead. If anything, it looked angry now instead of confused. The other predators began moving faster as their wounded packmate let out a roar that shook dust from the crystal spires. Jake realized he had just declared war on an entire species of apex predators with nothing but a rifle and 5 other Marines, who were probably going to think he had lost his mind. Behind him, the blue alien had stopped trembling and was staring at Jake with something that might have been amazement. Dr. Carter was shouting for him to fall back to the shuttle, but Jake knew it was too late for that. The monsters were too close, and the innocent aliens were too slow to escape. He chambered another round and prepared to find out what humans were really made of. The wounded predator charged at Jake with a speed that should have been impossible for something so large. Jake dove to the side as razor-sharp claws gouged deep scratches in the crystal floor where he had been standing. He rolled behind a fallen pillar and came up firing as the creature tried to follow him. His pulse rifle sent 3 quick bursts into the monster's flank. The energy blasts burned through its natural armor plating, and the thing stumbled sideways with a shriek that hurt Jake's ears. Green blood splattered across the ancient symbols on the walls, but the predator was still very much alive and very much angry. The other Marines had taken positions around the building and were engaging the rest of the pack. Jake could hear the distinctive whine of pulse rifles mixed with inhuman roars and the sound of claws scraping against stone. Through gaps in the ruined walls, he caught glimpses of his team using cover and movement to stay ahead of creatures that were bigger and stronger than anything they had trained to fight. Dr. Carter was still trying to get the blue alien to safety, but the creature seemed unable to move. Jake realized it was not just fear that was holding the alien in place. Its large dark eyes were focused on something beyond the immediate danger, and its mouth was moving in what looked like silent communication. More blue-skinned aliens began appearing from deeper in the ruins. They moved with the same graceful steps as the first one, but Jake could see they were weak and malnourished. Some were carrying what were obviously children, while others helped elderly members of their species who could barely walk. They were refugees, and this was probably one of the last safe places they had left. The predator Jake had wounded circled around his cover, looking for a clear shot at him. Jake waited until it committed to an attack and surprised it by charging forward instead of retreating. He jammed the barrel of his rifle under what he hoped was its jaw and pulled the trigger at point-blank range. The blast nearly took the creature's head off, and it collapsed in a heap of twitching limbs and leaking fluids. Jake felt a moment of satisfaction before he realized the other predators had heard their pack-mate die. The clicking sounds they made got louder and more urgent as they began converging on his position. Dr. Carter had managed to establish some kind of basic communication with the blue alien. She was showing it pictures on her tablet while pointing toward the shuttle. The alien nodded and began making gestures to its own people. Jake hoped they were telling them to run, but he was not sure any of them would make it to safety before the monsters caught them. 2 more predators appeared at the entrance to the building. These ones looked different from the first. Their armor was darker, and they had additional limbs that ended in something that looked like natural weapons. Jake guessed these were older or more experienced hunters, based on the way they moved with calculated patience instead of rushing in. His radio crackled with updates from his team. Corporal Danny White reported that they had killed one of the creatures, but lost Private Martinez when another one got too close. The numbers were not in their favor, and ammunition was running low. Captain Mitchell was demanding a status report, but Jake did not have time to explain the situation. The blue alien suddenly grabbed Dr. Carter's arm and pointed toward a section of wall that looked solid, but was apparently some kind of hidden door. The scientist nodded and began herding the other research personnel toward what Jake hoped was an escape route. The refugees were following them, but they moved too slowly, and the children were crying in fear. Jake made another decision that went against everything in his military training. Instead of staying with his assigned civilians, he moved toward the approaching predators to buy the aliens more time to escape. His rifle had maybe 20 shots left, and he was facing creatures that had been hunting and killing for probably millions of years. The first elite predator studied him with eyes that showed a level of intelligence Jake had not expected. It made a series of clicking sounds that might have been communication with its partner. They began to separate and flank him, which meant they understood tactics and could coordinate their attacks. Jake back toward the hidden door while keeping both creatures in sight. The refugees were moving through the opening, but there were still too many of them, and not enough time. One of the children stumbled, and its parents stopped to help it up. The delay was going to get them all killed. The predator on Jake's left made its move first. It leaped forward with claws extended, while its partner attacked from the right. Jake had dealt with coordinated attacks before during urban combat training, but never against anything this fast or this deadly. He threw himself backward and fired at the jumping predator while hoping the second one would not land on top of him. His shot caught the leaping creature in what might have been its throat, and it crashed to the ground, making gurgling sounds. The second predator landed where Jake had been standing and immediately spun to track him. Jake rolled away as claws carved gouges in the floor inches from his head. Carter was screaming at him to fall back, but Jake could see there were still blue aliens trying to get through the hidden door. An elderly one had fallen, and 2 others were trying to help it up. If Jake retreated now, those 3 would die, and probably several others as well. He came up firing and put 3 quick shots into the remaining predator's center mass. The creature staggered but did not go down. Its armor was thicker than the others, and his rifle was running low on power. Jake realized he was going to have to get creative if he wanted to survive the next few minutes. The wounded predator lunged at him again, but this time Jake was ready. He grabbed a piece of broken crystal from the floor and jammed it into the creature's wounded side as it passed him. The makeshift weapon went deeper than he expected, and the predator's roar turned into something that sounded almost like surprise. More monsters were approaching from outside the building. Jake could hear at least 3 different sets of claws clicking against stone as they got closer. His team was still fighting, but they were spread thin, trying to cover the retreat of the research personnel. The blue aliens were almost through the hidden door, but not quite fast enough. The wounded predator in front of Jake was getting slower as green. Blood pooled under its feet. Jake thought about finishing it off, but decided to save his remaining ammunition for the creatures that were not already dying. He backed toward the door while watching for the next wave of attackers. The first blue alien he had protected appeared next to Dr. Carter and made urgent gestures toward Jake. Carter nodded and called out that they had found a tunnel system that connected to other parts of the ruins. If they could reach it, there might be a way to escape the immediate area and find somewhere more defensible. Jake looked at the approaching predators, and then at the refugees who were counting on him to keep the monsters distracted for just a few more minutes. He checked his rifle's power indicator and saw he had maybe 10 shots left. The odds were terrible, but the alternative was letting innocent people die because he was not brave enough to stand his ground. He took a deep breath and prepared to find out exactly how much damage one human marine could do to a pack of alien predators. The tunnel system was more complex than Jake had expected. Dr. Carter led the group through passages that seemed to have been carved from solid rock by some ancient technology. The blue aliens moved through the darkness with confidence that suggested they knew these tunnels well. Jake brought up the rear with his remaining marines while listening for sounds of pursuit. The alien Jake had first protected stayed close to Dr. Carter and seemed to be serving as their guide. Through a combination of gestures and simple drawings, the creature had managed to communicate that its name was something that sounded like Zara to human ears. More importantly, Zara had shown them that the tunnel system connected to other refugee camps scattered throughout the ruins. Captain Mitchell's voice crackled through Jake's radio, demanding a full report on what had happened at the landing site. Jake gave him a quick summary of their encounter with both species and recommended immediate military backup. The captain's response was exactly what Jake had expected: disbelief followed by anger, followed by orders to evacuate all personnel immediately. The problem was that evacuation was no longer a simple option. The predators had surrounded the landing zone, and Corporal White reported seeing at least 20 of the creatures prowling around the shuttle. The research team was trapped underground with a group of alien refugees, while an unknown number of monsters hunted for them on the surface. Carter had managed to establish better communication with Zara and several other aliens who appeared to be leaders among the refugees. Using her tablet and a combination of mathematics and pictographs, she was learning about the history of both species. What she discovered made Jake's blood run cold. The predators called themselves something that translated roughly to the Eternal Hunt, while the blue-skinned aliens were known as the Veltar. The two species had been locked in a genocidal conflict for thousands of years, with the predators systematically hunting the Veltar across multiple star systems. This was not just a territorial dispute or competition for resources. It was extermination. Zara showed them images carved into the tunnel walls that depicted the history of her people. Once the Veltar had been a thriving civilization with cities that spanned entire continents and technology that could manipulate matter at the molecular level. But they had never developed weapons or military tactics, because violence was completely foreign to their nature. When the Krethmok had discovered them, the Veltar had no way to defend themselves. Their advanced technology meant nothing against creatures that lived for the hunt and had evolved specifically to kill other intelligent species. City after city had fallen until only scattered groups of refugees remained hiding in places like these ancient ruins. Jake studied the carvings and realized he was looking at a holocaust that had been going on for millennia. The Krethmok were not just predators, they were genocide specialists who had probably wiped out dozens of species before finding the Veltar. The refugees in these tunnels represented some of the last members of an entire civilization. The tactical situation became clearer as more Veltar refugees joined their group. There were roughly 200 survivors in this particular hiding place, with perhaps a dozen other camps scattered across the planet. The Krethmok hunting party consisted of about 50 individuals, but more would arrive once they reported finding a significant population of prey. Dr. Carter was fascinated by the Veltar technology and began working with their scientists to understand how their equipment functioned. Their tools were based on harmonic resonance and could reshape matter by altering its molecular vibration. It was incredibly advanced, but completely useless as a weapon because the Veltar had never imagined needing to hurt. Another living being, Jake, saw possibilities that the peaceful aliens had missed. If you could reshape matter, then you could potentially create barriers or traps that would slow down the Krethmok hunters. The Veltar had never thought of using their abilities defensively because they had never needed to until the hunters found them. He began working with Tony Rodriguez, the mission's engineer, to adapt Veltar technology for defensive purposes. Tony was a genius with mechanical systems, and he quickly grasped how the alien devices functioned. Within hours, they had created portable shields that could deflect claw attacks and sonic disruptors that interfered with Krethmok communication. The breakthrough came when Jake realized that the Krethmok relied heavily on pheromone tracking to coordinate their hunts. Dr. Carter's analysis of the dead predators revealed that they used chemical signals to mark territory and communicate with pack members. If humans could disrupt those signals, they might be able to confuse the hunters and break up their coordination. Sarah became instrumental in this effort. She knew Krethmok behavior patterns from years of hiding and running from them. The hunters always followed the same basic strategy: surround the prey, establish escape routes, then close in for the kill. They were efficient but predictable because they had never faced organized resistance. Jake began developing tactics specifically designed to counter Krethmok advantages. Instead of trying to match their strength and speed, humans would use mobility and misdirection. Instead of fighting them individually, human forces would coordinate attacks that isolated individual hunters and eliminated them one by one. The first test came when a Krethmok patrol discovered one of the tunnel entrances. Jake led a team of Marines and Veltar volunteers armed with the new equipment to engage the hunters before they could summon reinforcements. The battle was brief but decisive, with human weapons and Veltar technology combining to devastating effect. The sonic disruptors confused the hunters, while portable shields protected the defenders from claw attacks. Jake's team used hit and run tactics to separate the predators, then eliminated them with concentrated fire. For the first time in recorded history, Krethmok hunters had been defeated by their intended prey. News of the victory spread quickly through the refugee camps. Veltar, who had lived in terror for generations, began to believe that survival might be possible. More importantly, they began to understand that their advanced technology could be weaponized if they were willing to abandon their peaceful philosophy. Jake worked with Veltar engineers to mass produce the new defensive equipment, while Dr. Carter established communication networks between the scattered camps. For the first time, the refugees were coordinating their activities instead of simply hiding and hoping the hunters would pass them by. The Krethmok response was swift and brutal. A larger hunting party arrived with heavier equipment and more experienced hunters, but Jake was ready for them. He had spent days studying their tactics and developing countermeasures for every advantage they possessed. The second battle took place in the ruins above the tunnel system. Jake's combined force of Marines and armed Veltar used the ancient architecture to their advantage, creating kill zones and ambush points that neutralized the hunters' mobility. The result was another human victory and the elimination of an entire Krethmok pack. Captain Mitchell, arrived with reinforcements just as Jake was planning the next phase of operations. The captain was skeptical of getting involved in an alien conflict, but Jake convinced him that humanity had already chosen sides the moment. They decided to protect innocent people from monsters. The reinforcements brought heavy weapons and military specialists who began training Veltar volunteers in human combat techniques. Dr. Carter established a research facility in the tunnels where human and Veltar scientists worked together to develop new technologies that combined the best of both species capabilities. Jake realized they were no longer just fighting for survival. They were laying the foundation for something larger, a coalition of species that could stand against the Krethmok expansion. The refugees were becoming soldiers, and the soldiers were becoming the core of a resistance movement that could spread to other worlds. The war was just beginning, but for the first time in thousands of years, the prey had learned to bite back. The arrival of the Krethmok High Hunt changed everything. Jake watched from the command center as massive bioships descended from orbit like living asteroids. Each vessel was the size of a human cruiser, but grown rather than built with organic armor that could heal itself and weapons that fired living projectiles. The hunters had decided this world was worth their personal attention. Intelligence gathered from captured Krethmok equipment revealed the true scope of what humanity had stumbled into. The High Hunt represented the most elite predators in Krethmok, society individuals who had spent centuries perfecting the art of killing intelligent species. They viewed the human resistance as an interesting challenge rather than a serious threat. Jake studied the tactical data with growing concern. The bioships carried not just weapons, but entire ecosystems designed to support extended hunting campaigns. The High Hunt could remain in system for years, if necessary, slowly wearing down any resistance through attrition. Traditional military tactics would not work against enemies who treated warfare as entertainment. Captain Mitchell had been promoted to admiral and given command of a small fleet of human warships. But even with reinforcements, they were outnumbered and outgunned. The Krethmok bioships were immune to most human weapons, and their living hulls could adapt to counter new threats. What humanity needed was not more firepower, but an entirely different approach to the problem. The solution came from an unexpected source. Zara had been working with Dr. Carter to translate ancient Veltar archives and discovered references to other species that had faced the Krethmok over the centuries. Most had been exterminated, but a few had escaped to distant worlds where they continued to hide from the hunters. Humanity was not alone in this fight. Jake proposed a radical strategy. Instead of defending one world against the High Hunt, they would reach out to every surviving species and create a galaxy-wide resistance network. The Krethmok had never faced coordinated opposition from multiple species because their victims had always been isolated and unable to communicate with each other. The first contact was with the Zeeth, a species of crystalline beings who had fled their homeworld 300 years earlier when the Krethmok discovered them. The Zeeth had developed cloaking technology that made their ships invisible to Krethmok sensors, but they had never used it offensively. Jake convinced them to share their stealth capabilities in exchange for human military training. Next came the Verdani, a plant-like species that could manipulate biological systems at the cellular level. They had survived by hiding in dense jungle worlds where the Krethmok found hunting difficult. The Verdani could create diseases that specifically targeted Krethmok physiology, but had never considered using biological warfare against their persecutors. The Ethon were energy beings who existed in gas, giant atmospheres, and could manipulate electromagnetic fields. The Krethmok had never been able to hunt them effectively, but the Ethon had assumed they were safe and ignored the fate of other species. Jake showed them that isolation was not protection and convinced them to use their abilities to disrupt Krethmok communications. Building the coalition required more than just military cooperation. Each species had different biology, psychology, and technology that needed to be integrated into a unified command structure. Jake found himself serving as both military coordinator and diplomatic liaison between species that had never imagined working together. The breakthrough came when Dr. Carter discovered that all the surviving species shared certain characteristics. They were either naturally peaceful like the Veltar, or had evolved in environments that discouraged aggressive behavior. The Krethmok had specifically targeted civilizations that could not fight back effectively, leaving only the most passive species to survive. This realization led to a new understanding of Krethmok psychology. The hunters were not interested in challenging opponents. They wanted easy prey that would provide sport without real danger. They had become so accustomed to hunting defenseless species that they had no experience dealing with organized resistance. Jake began exploiting this weakness by making the hunt as difficult and unpredictable as possible. Coalition forces used hit-and-run tactics that denied the Krethmok the straightforward confrontations they preferred. Stealth ships harassed their supply lines, while biological agents targeted their food sources, and psychological warfare operations disrupted their pack hierarchies. The first major victory came when a combined fleet of human and coalition ships ambushed a Krethmok bioship using Zeeth cloaking technology and Verdani bioweapons. The hunters had never faced enemies they could not see or biological agents that specifically targeted their immune systems. The bioship was destroyed with all hands, marking the first time in recorded history that prey species had successfully hunted the high hunt. The Krethmok response was predictable but ineffective. They increased their aggressive behavior and began targeting civilian populations in retaliation for military losses. This strategy backfired because it convinced neutral species that the hunters could not be reasoned with or avoided. The coalition grew larger as more species chose to fight rather than hide. Jake realized that the war had become about more than just survival. The coalition was developing into something unprecedented in galactic history, a multi-species alliance based on mutual defense and shared values rather than conquest or exploitation. The species that had survived Krethmok predation were naturally inclined toward cooperation and peaceful coexistence. The tide turned definitively when coalition forces captured a high hunt bioship intact. The vessel contained detailed records of Krethmok expansion over the past millennium, including the locations of their breeding worlds and primary bases. For the first time, the hunters became the hunted as coalition fleets began striking at targets deep in Krethmok space. The psychological impact was devastating. Krethmok society was built around the concept of the eternal hunt with hunters, gaining status by pursuing ever more challenging prey. When their own worlds came under attack, many hunters experienced something they had never felt before: fear. Some even began questioning whether their entire way of life was sustainable. Jake led the assault on the primary Krethmok breeding facility, a massive biostructure that produced new hunters for deployment across the galaxy. The battle was fierce, with the defenders fighting with desperate fury to protect their future generations. But coalition forces had advantages the hunters could not counter, including weapons that turned their own biology against them. The destruction of the breeding facility marked the end of Krethmok expansion. Without new hunters to replace their losses, the remaining high hunt members found themselves fighting a losing war of attrition against an enemy that grew stronger with each victory. Many hunters began retreating toward their core worlds, while others simply vanished into deep space. Admiral Mitchell stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching Krethmok bioships fleeing the system in disorder. The predators who had terrorized the galaxy for millennia were running from an alliance of species they had dismissed as prey. The hunt was over, and the monsters had lost. But Jake knew this was only the beginning. The coalition had proven that cooperation between species was possible, and that even the most dangerous predators could be defeated by those willing to stand together. What they had built here would spread to other worlds and other species until the galaxy became a place where monsters could no longer hunt with impunity. The prey had not just learned to bite back, they had learned to hunt. 2 years had passed since the last Krethmok bioship fled human space, and Colonel Jake Morrison could barely recognize the galaxy around him. From the observation deck of Station Unity, he watched ships from dozens of species arriving and departing. In peaceful coordination, where once there had been only scattered refugees hiding from predators, there was now a thriving interstellar community. The station itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering, built using Veltar matter manipulation, technology and human construction techniques. It served as the headquarters for the Galactic Defense Initiative. The GDI had grown from a desperate alliance of survivors into the galaxy's primary peacekeeping force with bases on hundreds of worlds and fleets that patrolled former Krethmok hunting grounds. Sarah approached Jake at the observation window, moving with the same graceful steps he remembered from their first meeting in the Crystal Ruins. She had changed dramatically over the past 2 years. No longer the terrified refugee cowering from monsters, she now served as the GDI's Director of Species Relations and spoke fluent human, along with a dozen other languages. The transformation was not just personal but cultural. The Veltar had maintained their peaceful nature, but learned to channel it into protective rather than passive behavior. Their cities were rebuilding on worlds that had been abandoned for centuries, and their population was growing for the first time in millennia. They had rediscovered hope. Dr. Carter had established the Interspecies Research Institute in the lower levels of the station, where scientists from different worlds worked together on projects that would have been impossible for any single species. The combination of human creativity, Veltar technology, and abilities from other coalition members was producing breakthroughs in everything from medicine to faster-than-light travel. The most important development was the Galactic Refugee Council, which had evolved from a military alliance into a democratic government representing over 50 species. Each member world sent representatives to the council, which made decisions about resource allocation, territorial disputes, and responses to threats. It was messy and sometimes inefficient, but it worked because it was based on cooperation rather than domination. Jake reflected on how much his own role had changed. He was no longer just a Marine sergeant following orders, but a leader helping to shape the future of galactic civilization. The GDI had made him their supreme commander, but he preferred to think of himself as someone who helped others find the courage to protect themselves. The success had not come without costs. Many good people had died in the war against the Krethmok, including several of Jake's original Marines. Private Martinez was remembered on the memorial wall, along with thousands of others from dozens of species who had given their lives so that monsters could no longer hunt with impunity. The Krethmok themselves had not been completely eliminated. Small groups still operated in the outer regions of the galaxy, hunting isolated settlements and causing problems for colonial expeditions. But they were no longer an existential threat to intelligent life. Most had retreated to their core worlds, where they struggled to adapt to a galaxy that was no longer afraid of them. Some Krethmok had even begun to change their ways. A few younger hunters had made contact with GDI representatives, expressing interest in finding alternatives to the predatory lifestyle that had defined their species for millions of years. It was controversial and difficult, but Jake believed that even monsters could learn to be something else if given the chance. The children were perhaps the most encouraging sign of progress. In the station's residential sections, young beings from different species played together without the fear and suspicion that had defined previous generations. Human children learned Veltar mathematics, while alien youngsters played human games like soccer and chess. They were growing up in a galaxy where cooperation was normal rather than exceptional. Admiral Mitchell had retired from active duty, but remained as an advisor to the GDI command structure. He often joked that his biggest challenge now was keeping up with the paperwork generated by managing a multi-species military organization. The bureaucracy was enormous, but necessary to coordinate the efforts of beings with different biologies, psychologies, and cultural backgrounds. The economic benefits of cooperation were becoming apparent as well. Trade between member worlds had increased dramatically, with each species contributing resources and knowledge that others needed. The Zeeth provided advanced materials science, while the Verdani offered biological solutions to industrial problems. Humanity contributed manufacturing techniques and organizational skills that helped coordinate everything. Jake's personal life had also changed in ways he had never expected. He had formed relationships with beings from other species that went beyond professional cooperation. The bonds forged in combat had evolved into genuine friendships based on shared values and mutual respect. The galaxy had become smaller and more connected. The most significant change was in humanity's role among the stars. Humans had arrived as explorers and scientists, but had become known as protectors and organizers. Other species looked to them for leadership, not because they were superior, but because they had proven willing to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. Zara joined Jake at the window, and together they watched a new group of refugees arriving from a distant system where Krethmok raiders had attacked a peaceful mining colony. The refugees would be given temporary housing, medical care, and assistance in rebuilding their lives. Some would choose to stay and join the GDI, while others would return to their homeworlds when it was safe. The arrival of refugees was now routine rather than desperate. The GDI had early warning systems that detected Krethmok activity and rapid response fleets that could intervene before situations became critical. The galaxy had learned to defend itself, and predators could no longer operate with the confidence they had once enjoyed. Jake thought about that moment 2 years ago when he had stepped between a trembling alien and the monsters that hunted her. It had seemed like a simple decision at the time, driven by instinct rather than any grand vision of the future. But that single act of courage had started a chain reaction that transformed the galaxy. The lesson was not that humans were special or superior, but that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up to bullies to inspire others to do the same. The Veltar had possessed the technology to defend themselves all along, but they needed someone to show them that resistance was possible. Other species had similar capabilities, but lacked the confidence to